You're very welcome to this latest video. This video will be talking about the ongoing situation in Venezuela, the ongoing attempts to destabilize that country, to overthrow its democratically elected and popular government of Nicolas Maduro. This follows on from the decades of of US imperialism to impose its hegemony over Latin America. This meeting has been held by the Communist Party of Ireland online so that we can raise awareness about this issue and to support the work of those involved in solidarity for Venezuela and all other peoples in Latin America. So we have with us Dr. Francisco Domínguez. He's the Secretary of the Venezuela Solidarity Campaign in Britain. He's an academic at Middlesex University and a specialist in Latin America. So, Francisco, thank you very much for joining us tonight. Would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, well, I came over to Britain running away from Pinochet back in '79. I had a difference with him, and he was a bit more powerful than I was. It was difficult to get used to this here with the terrible weather, and you know, I even got accustomed to this, even to the point I love fish and chips with vinegar. And I had the opportunity to go into an academic career, did economics, did well in my BA, then MA, and then finished PhD. And ever since '79, when I got here, I started to do work on solidarity with Latin America, which I've been doing non-stop, and eventually ended up, as secretary of the Venezuela Solidarity Campaign.
So I suppose the first question would be, how would you describe the ongoing effects of economic war in Venezuela, the current attempts by imperialism to exert its grip on that country specifically?
Well, ever since the 2008 economic crisis that hit the world and destabilized because of the dependence on exports, destabilized many of the Latin American countries, Brazil, and others suffered enormously. The strategists in the United States, in the State Department, decided that this was the moment to try to reassert their control and authority and hegemony over the region. And 2009, a coup d'etat in Honduras, then followed by several other destabilizations, a huge campaign against the Argentinian left government, and they managed to win the election there. The same with the impeachment against Dilma Rousseff in Brazil, and then Lula was accused of all sorts of funny things, and eventually was forced out of the presidential race. And the United States, through their machinery propaganda, managed to get, fascist Bolsonaro, and they've been, literally one by one, recovering, as it were, their control. And the cherry in the pie, or the jewel in the crown, is obviously Venezuela. And the reason is resources. Venezuela has the largest deposits of oil in the world, larger than in Saudi Arabia. And it's got, according to some estimate, at the present levels of consumption in the world, it has oil for the next 300 years. So you can imagine the United States being able to get hold of that would be incredibly important. But Venezuela has other things as well. I think it's the second country with the largest deposit of gold in the world. Now, the United States depends very heavily on oil. And if you think about it, the dollar is quite weak because many countries have been pulling out of the dollar system. Turkey, Iran, Venezuela itself, certainly China, Russia. These are powerful countries. And as a result of that, the weakening of the dollar is threatening the system, the monetary system. So having control of gold to prop up your currency is quite an important thing. There is only a small problem. There is a Bolivarian government that is prepared to defend their people and is prepared to defend their national sovereignty. And the United States has done everything possible since 1999, now, this is no exaggeration, to try to get rid of this government. And ever since Trump got into the White House, the interventionist machinery, the regime change machinery has been extremely active, and the amount of the intensity and the amount of sanctions they're not as multilateral, coercive. There are measures, unilateral measures, coercive measures. That's the name for them technically. They've applied so many. I mean, Venezuela cannot say oil. Venezuela has its finances blocked. Venezuela has its airline sanctioned. Venezuela has most of the members of the government sanctioned. And Venezuela can operate in stock exchange in the United States. And the sanctions that when the United States applies, it normally takes an extraterritorial dimension. So this threatens and intimidates many countries, many companies, many governments, many banks around the world. And the European Union particularly, which is very cowardly, capitulates to this pressure. And therefore the result is havoc in the Venezuelan economy. They suffer from hyperinflation. Their GDP has contracted so massively, it's even difficult to actually give the figures. Nevertheless, the support of the government remains firm. The resistance is extraordinary, and they're beginning to come out of it. So therefore, the United States getting more desperate and trying something different than just sanctions. That's the situation is. I can give you some details in terms of the effects of this, but that's for further discussion, I suppose.
And I suppose, what have the Venezuelan state and the public organizations in Venezuela done to help the people of Venezuela from the effects of this economic warfare?
Well, the first point to make is that whenever a country is faced with such a level of economic onslaught, normally countries in the world, apply austerity measures. They go to the IMF or worse, the World Bank, and then they get these packages, which are terrible. And then they flip these terrible packages on the population. The European Union has done it. The Brazilians have done it. All the right-wing governments in the region and in the world have done it. And the government of Venezuela, because it's a different government, decided not to do that. What it decided to do is to put people before profits. And what they have done, they set up a system of food distribution, which is known as clubs. There are thousands of these are individual bodies that exist in all the neighborhoods, in all the districts throughout the country. And they give food at very subsidized, heavily subsidized prices to about 7 million families, literally every single month, sometimes twice a month, depending on how it goes. And the reason why I'm saying this is because the United States is targeting deliberately the companies around the world, Brazil, Mexico, and other places that actually are selling food to Venezuela in order to stop it, to make sure that there is a collapse, there is a humanitarian crisis, so that they have the justification to go to some international body to go for it. And Venezuela has defended its interests very nicely and also very skillfully. It's established alliances across the world, which are very interesting. Certainly has very interesting alliances with China, with Russia, with Iran, with Turkey, and there is plenty more. And as a result of that, it's been able to obtain what is essential to maintain the thing going. And at the same time, it ensures that the population is organized at the grassroots levels in thousands and thousands and thousands of communities. This is no exaggeration. There are something like 52,000 communal councils in the country. These participatory democracy, is such that the level of participation at the grassroots level is such that anything that goes wrong from the top down, it immediately gets a reaction from the bottom up. And things are rectifying at the local level and then further up all the way to the governorships as well as to the state. And the government is extremely responsive. And this has ensured, number one, that no hospital has been closed down. No public sector workers have been laid off. The education system remained absolutely identical. No school has been closed down. No reduction of the budget for social expenditure. Several years ago, the total amount of the budget devoted to social expenditure was about 64%. Now, after several adjustments that have been made, the level of social expenditure from the budget is 75%. Everything goes into the people. People before profit, absolutely about everything else. And on top of that, the government has been able to not only do that, but actually they have built more than 3,100,000 houses for the poor, which are heavily subsidized, and these programs are continuing. There's a huge expansion of the agricultural sector. There is a huge expansion of domestic production to make sure that they don't depend any more on external factors. And the proportion of the oil revenue that goes into the budget in terms of their calculation today is less than 30%. A few years ago was more than 70%. So clearly the basket of export, chocolate, rum, which you should consume, and everything else, they are really diversifying. I mean, it's still difficult, but they've been able to sustain the situation, and the support that Maduro is obtaining is getting bigger by the day. And this is what has made the revolution survive. In other words, because it's a different system, because it has different values, because people before anything else is what made it to survive this far.
One of the things the Venezuelan state has been successful in is maintaining that popular legitimacy, that mandate from the people of Venezuela. We saw the recent sort of fiasco surrounding Juan Guaido, who was sort of handpicked by the US to lead some sort of uprising against the Venezuelan state, and seems to have collapsed almost laughably. Could you talk about I suppose, the effects of that, the whole Guaido situation, or even recently where it came out that he was smuggled across into Colombia and so on?
Yeah. I mean, imagine if the United States, the most powerful country on earth, were to appoint, unilaterally, with all their machinery behind it, an alternative government to any government in the world, it would be so destabilizing. You can imagine. I mean, they can do that to Britain because with Trump anything is possible. Now the effects on Venezuela at the beginning looked like were absolutely threatening. Nevertheless, the key to the Guaido operation was to produce one, a split within the Chavista forces, and two, a split within the army and the government. This failed. They've tried absolutely everything, violence. They've tried the military force, using military force, trying to push through humanitarian aid coming from the United States in order to take over some city and then proclaim a liberated territory and, fly in Guaido, and then the rest as they did in Cuba. It will require international assistance. The United States will recognize the government, and then they will send the troops and so on. They have tried absolutely everything. They've tried paramilitarism, narco traffickers, you name it, and every time it failed, and failed miserably. In fact, I think one dimension of this is missed to most people, or close to most people, and it's this. It's not that Guaido is stupid in the things that he does, where he gets very poor results, sometimes, really counterproductive results to his own position. But the reason why he does this is not because he's independent. He follows literally to the letter instructions from the United States State Department. And this is what gives me confidence. If these idiots in the State Department, apart from being brutal and vicious, which they are, their advice is so terrible that it's destroyed, literally, this part of the opposition. Right now, what you have is a split within the opposition. One section is discussing with the government to organize and prepare all the conditions for elections for the National Assembly, which is, going to replace Guaido, is going to be history in a few months. It's already history, for all I know. And more important than that, Guaido current is so desperate that today or yesterday took a decision to actually join the government in its efforts to fight against the pandemic in Venezuela. And I don't know where all these threats, because they've been calling for military intervention in Venezuela, they've been calling for sanctions more and more and so on, and that seems to have gone. Maduro a few days ago reported on national television that as far as he was aware, Guaido is already in a foreign embassy. And he said, I'm not going to tell you which one, but it looks to me that it's the French embassy. It's not clear exactly to me what that means, but obviously Guaido seems to be a spent force in the United States, and this is what worries me. It might lead to the following question. Given the United States has run out of options, because they've tried absolutely everything, from paramilitarism, mercenaries, you name it. God knows what they're going to try now. And the one thing that is very worrying is the very fact that they send 800 troops, elite troops, veterans from Iraq and the Middle East, to assist the Colombian government in fighting against narco trafficking. And remember, the government of the United States has declared formally as a legal position of the government by the Justice Department that the Venezuelan government is a narco-traffic state, a narco-traffic terrorist state. So all the conditions legally exist for the United States to wage war against Venezuela. And on top of that, the United States has 10 military bases in Colombia. So this is extremely worrying because out of desperation, if Trump cannot get some Trump triumph, some victory in foreign policy, he may decide to go for Venezuela, he may not, we do not know, but that's the important warning that we want to send to everybody.
And what's the role? What role would Colombia play in this? So there's a lot of, for people who don't know, a lot of destabilizing factors in Colombia. The peace process that was brokered in Havana between the Colombian government and FARC rebels was thrown out, and members of the FARC are now basically being extrajudicially murdered.
Yeah.
How does that factor in, that role of right-wing and narco paramilitaries that have been massing on the border with Venezuela? How does that affect the situation in Venezuela itself?
Yeah, the United States made an agreement with the Uribe government back in 2009, which is called the Defense Cooperation Agreement. We wrote in VSC, we wrote a pamphlet about it, denouncing it. And the whole idea was to establish, 7 more military bases on top of the 3 that the United States already has there. And although the purpose was to fight against, narco trafficking, everybody knows, and everybody knew at the time, that it was Venezuela. That is to say, the United States have been preparing the ground for military action. And the reason why I'm saying this is because if you look at the mercenary attack, I don't have too much time, so I don't want to go into many details on this, but the contract, people read the 8 pages which were published in the media internationally, even in the Washington Post, but there is a few appendixes that we examined and we studied, and we wrote a document, an analysis of it, I certainly did. And when you read it, the purpose is, number one, these mercenaries will take out Maduro, Diosdado Cabello, and the whole leadership. They'll assassinate them. The idea that we'll take them and then flying them into the United States was just a joke. The purpose was to assassinate, and it says there in the contract, either kidnap them or kill them. That's number one. Number two, then they will appoint Guaido as the government. And then after that appointment, they will proceed to purge the whole society of Chavismo. And they were talking about, expelling immediately 20,000 Cubans by force. Then they will talk about, purging the armed forces. Then they will purge the militia, which is 3.5 million. Then they will purge all the committees where Chavismo exists. You can imagine the level of extermination that involves cannot be done by 60 mercenaries. And the only possibility to implement that plan is by bringing in mass troops from somewhere else. And I think Colombia is where they will come from, as well as from the United States. So even though the implementation, the execution of the mercenary attack was shambolic, the US plan is in the appendix of that contract. That's what they want to do. So therefore, any possible attack will involve Colombia centrally. We'll see how far they're prepared to go. They have a massive, I wouldn't call it insurrection, but massive opposition in the country to the very incompetent way they're dealing with the pandemic. The application of, austerity measures of the neoliberal kind, as well as, the continued extermination, elimination of, social leaders and so on. Plus, on top of that, the levels of corruption I've never seen being so high. And there is a massive opposition to the new troops. And even, the left, Gustavo Petro, Colombia Humana, and the Polo Democrático, all saying, they're all demonstrating and so on. So it's quite difficult for them in this condition. Now, after the massive explosion in the United States, we'll see how far the United States is prepared to go. I think politically, in terms of the coming election, it looks like Trump is dead.
Mm. It's sort of interesting, I suppose, bringing that up. But what's going on in the US now, how it has any right to tell any other sovereign country how to run its own affairs. But as long as US imperialism exists, it'll do that.
I think they will try, but sorry to interrupt. I think they will try. The problem they have is, damn if they do, because they'll face 3.5 million people ready in arms, very well trained. They have a solid, 500,000 military forces, extremely well equipped with very modern equipment of every kind. One of the generals in an interview on television said, "What the hell are they talking about? That the war is going to take place in Venezuela?" He said, "It's not going to take place in Venezuela. The theater of war is going to be Colombia. Let me tell you this," he said. And he was quite, bullish about it. This is public. He said, "A Sukhoi, you know what they are," he said, Russian warplanes, will get into the presidential palace in Bogota in 11 minutes, in 11 seconds. He says, so they should think about it very carefully before they do anything. And obviously the United States knows this. And so therefore, from their point of view, were they to attack, which they might, the difficulty is that they need a quick victory politically. If they get bogged down 1 week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, you can imagine this is going to be a nightmare. And therefore, if the casualties start to grow, even though whatever damage they cause in Venezuela itself, so they know this is the consequences. And if they don't, then they will lose the opportunity they have. And therefore, Venezuela will consolidate itself with incredible alliances internationally, which are the basis, seem to be the embryo for a new, world geopolitics with multilateral powers and, nicer friendship and collaboration. That's what they face.
And one of the things as well is that Venezuela is their health service has done very well to combat COVID-19. Could you talk briefly about that? What measures they've taken to make them, along with Cuba and Nicaragua, one of the most positive examples of how to treat this pandemic in the current crisis of economic warfare against the country and everything?
Yeah, they have been on, quite severe lockdown for more than 70 days now. I think it's more than 70 days. It's from the 15th of March. As soon as Maduro realized that it was a serious problem, he went immediately for it. So they have a system which is called the Patria system, by which people register and they're given a QR code. And the government organized this questioning, survey of people, and people respond, from home, from their phones, as it were. And they got the number of people registered on that is 19 million. And they began to respond in terms of symptoms. And anybody who had more than 2 symptoms. And because of the Barrio Adentro system, the health system, the hundreds of thousands, thousands of health workers, doctors, and so on, these people were visited immediately, literally on that day or the day after. And if they were discovered to be contaminated, then they immediately, measures would be taken. They would be isolated, the family would be looked after, and so on. And they did this so successfully that actually they managed to contain the pandemic for about 7 or 8 weeks to something like 600. And what happens is suddenly some countries that have a lot of migrants from Venezuela discover that after inviting them to come in, they discovered it was better to expel them, use xenophobia against them, treating them like dogs. I mean, it's really disgusting, in order to make sure that they went back. And as a result of going back, they will go to porous borders and so on. The idea was to increment the amount of people contaminate and contaminate the population. That's the calculation. So from 600 some weeks ago, 3-4 weeks ago, with 10 people dead, they maintained 10 people dead, literally every single week. Then now they are in the region of 1,952, which is the latest figure. And the reason is 75% are people who come from abroad, who are infected. They're all in hospitals, they're all in clinics, they're all under treatment, and they expect these to, to work. And the European Union has just organized and put huge amount of money to bring more Venezuelan migrants back to Venezuela. I think the idea is to destabilize it. The Venezuelans are ready to have it. And the reason why they have so many resources to deal with this was because they had huge amounts of support from China. China sent them millions, literally 4 million tests, quick tests, and hundreds of thousands of other tests, plus all health inputs necessary, as well as The Venezuelans work with the United Nations, the International Red Cross, and everybody else. And as a result of that, the population is pretty safe, even though some of them in some of the barrios misbehave. And the National Guard is there to ensure that they do. Compared to everybody else, Venezuela is the country that's carried out more tests than anybody else in Latin America, and is the one that has the lowest level of contamination compared to any other country in Latin America, and is one of the high, rates very high in the world.
And I suppose those sort of achievements would stand up very well internationally as well. Could you talk about the role of international solidarity with Venezuela? For instance, one of the iconic moments was the defense of the embassy in Washington from the coup attempt. And of course, there were trumped up charges against the people who courageously did that. Could you talk about how Venezuela responds to those type of international solidarity demonstrations?
Sure. Just to finish the old point, the previous point very briefly, is the socialist state, the organization of society in Venezuela is so different and is so well organized. That obviously played a central role. All the services are public. All the attention is free of charge at the point of delivery. And where they not have had that system, which they call it the Venezuela social system. I call it Venezuela socialist system. And it works pretty well. Regarding your point, solidarity has been extremely important. I participated myself in several international solidarity events organized in Venezuela, and the level of support is gigantic. The difficulty is organizing it. Now, the support that Venezuela enjoys in Latin America is gigantic, because it enjoys the support of mass parties like the Workers' Party in Brazil, the FSLN in Nicaragua, the FMLN in El Salvador, Morena in Mexico, the Kirchner in Argentina. This is secure. Obviously they continue to do work and so on. In Africa, it's massive. It's absolutely gigantic. There is no question about it. In Asia, they have China. Once you have that, there is nothing much to worry about. And many of the Asian countries, such as the Philippines, South Korea, are not quite as strongly friendly of Venezuela as China, but certainly are quite sympathetic and they are not hostile, quite the opposite. The problem lies in Europe. Let me tell you this, which is the point I make all the time. Nothing legitimizes US foreign policy, on Venezuela and other places than the abject support it gets from the European Union. So therefore, this is the key. And it's quite difficult to organize that support here. It's quite fragmented, people are frightened, the media is extremely powerful. It can't destroy the politician, I totally understand their apprehension. So it is extremely important we organize it here because it's strategic. If you come to defending the embassy, we might defend the embassy, we may not defend the embassy, we'll see. What is interesting is the very fact that although most of the European countries formally recognize Guaido, they have not recognized Maduro's ambassadors in the whole of Europe. They're still there. And more interesting than that, when Federica Mogherini, when he made a statement about that some time ago, he said, we recognize Guaido's representatives, but not as ambassadors. They are Guaido's representatives. They can talk to us if necessary. We might be able to, we'd be happy to talk to them, but they're not ambassadors. They will not have they will not obtain that status from us. So in that sense, since the weakening, and more interestingly than that, the European Union recently, particularly through its current foreign minister, Josep Borrell, a Spanish guy, has said 4 times now, I think, that it's about time that sanctions against countries such as Venezuela are stopped, are suspended during the period of the pandemic. The Pope said as much, and the General Secretary of the United Nations said as much. So if there is a campaign that we can organize, very concretely, very strongly, is that one. We have a resolution we're working on. We have a lot of support already, and we want to talk to all friendly parties, people like yourselves, and solidarity organizations that we actually campaign very heavily in, various countries individually to say, your government has no reason to continue to support one Guaido. So withdraw that support because he's demonstrated he's a criminal. He gets, in cahoots with narco traffickers. He has organized coup d'etat. He has no democratic credentials whatsoever, if he ever did. So withdraw the support. I don't think we're going to get too far with that one, but certainly the pressure would be nice. And the second one, as a separate campaign, is, help us to suspend the sanctions of and in that sense, we want the European Union to release monies held retained illegally by several banks. Certainly, we're working on the Bank of England ourselves because of the gold. And there is a litigation that the Venezuelan government presented against the government, and I think there seems to be interesting progress there. They haven't told me too much about it, and I don't want them to tell me more. But it seems to be going well. So that's the campaign. So suspend the sanctions, stop the aggression, and certainly withdraw the support against Guaido. And if it comes to something more dramatic, such as perhaps organizing international brigades to go and defend the revolution because the youngs decided to attack, we might have to go there that way or defend the embassies over here. But that's where things are at the moment. And the more we have in Europe and the more we weaken the pro-interventionists, the pro-young in Europe, the better it is for Venezuela and for the world, actually.
And talking about the role of a solidarity campaign in Britain is also very important. Britain itself has played a role in what's going on in Venezuela. Of course, it'll be no surprise to an Irish audience that British imperialism is involved in some fashion. They've sent ships to join the naval blockades of Venezuela, and they've also stolen, I believe it's more than $1 billion in gold reserves that have been held in the Bank of England that rightfully belong to the Venezuelan state and the Venezuelan public economy. Could you talk about more specifically the role of Britain itself, and I suppose more on what your organisation, your type of work is doing?
Yeah, the British government, the Tory government, has been instrumental in legitimizing deliberately and with enthusiasm, U.S. foreign policy of Venezuela. So, for example, Jeremy Hunt was a foreign secretary at the time when Maduro was elected with 6.7 million votes in a very clean election. It's the best electoral system in the world, according to Jimmy Carter. And he was summoned to the State Department for 3 hours. And after 3 hours, he came out and made a statement saying that, the election in Venezuela has been a fraud because there have been stuffed ballot boxes. There are no ballot boxes in Venezuela because the election is completely electronic. So that gives you an idea of how under pressure they are. And ever since, they recognize Guaido, and they've been quite instrumentally supported just about every single line of the U.S. foreign policy on, after all, U.S. imperialism is junior partner of the United States, a sort of military and political appendix of the United States, really, if you think about it. In no war that the United States has been involved, Britain has not been part of, literally all of them, particularly in the last period. And when it comes to the question of the gold, well, that was completely ridiculous. People went to the bank and the bank said, we are to retain them because the government gave us the instruction. We went to the government and the government said, no, we don't tell the bank what to do because it's autonomous. So this is bullshit. It's clear they want to retain it illegally because they think they can get money out of it. They have done this to Libya. They have done this to Iraq. They robbed the gold and the reserves of those countries, literally, hands full of stuff, really disgusting. And more important that in the last period, they decided now to send these Argos military warship. France sent also another one, and so did the Netherlands. It's 3 countries that are participating in this blockade. They are not saying much. And what is worse about the whole thing is that there is a system called AIM, A-I-M. I'm not sure how it works, but it's something like the GPS for ships. So they are supposed to register, everywhere they go, they are supposed to leave a trail. These 3 trips, the Dutch one, the French one, and the British one, decided to disconnect that. So nobody knows where they are. That gives you an idea of where how dodgy the thing is. But worse than all of that, they invited Guaido, and he came over. We complained about it, raise hell if he could, but not much anyway. because we're small. And what has transpired recently, and the FCO, the Foreign Office, has set up a secretive unit for the reconstruction of Venezuela, where they are going to share the spoils once the government of Maduro is overthrown. And worse than that, Vanessa Newman, the Guaido representative in the UK, somebody who is in the oil business, an extreme right-winger, produced some WhatsApp stuff where she said she was prepared to give up the Essequibo, which is the territory that Venezuela claims next to Guyana, which, Venezuela is very peacefully trying to discuss this and try to sort it out. They know it's a long thing. So therefore, not only Vanessa Newman and Guaido were prepared to hand over the wealth of the country for political support. So all the protestations by the UK government, by the Tory government, that they're doing this for democracy, free elections, and that is bullshit. The real thing is they are totally engaged in trying to get colonial pillage after the overthrow of the Maduro government once and if regime change is successful. We have to make sure that these things is raised, and if we can raise these matters, whatever government in Europe is involved in parliament, that would be the best part of it. One question, one innocent question raised in parliament that we send the response to Venezuela has a huge repercussion in the whole world. That's extremely important. So that's something that Solidarity Organization can do. We've been trying to raise this over here, but it's quite difficult because in the last period, the Labour Party was defeated and things have been disorganized. People are getting together again. Coming together, but that's where we are. So the role of UK imperialism is absolutely central to everything. And we have to make sure that, over here, we do everything to ensure that they behave.
And it just seems to be that whatever imperialism seems to throw at Venezuela, it still seems to be standing strong. How do you explain the success of the government and the social system in Venezuela in managing to do that?
I think it's unless, and this has got nothing to do with China, unless you carry out the revolution and you also carry out a cultural revolution, that is to say, you transform the people. I mean, to satisfy their immediate economic needs because of poverty, destitution, and so on is essential. And Chavez began to do that in 1999. But just to leave it at that, and then making sure that they are passive recipients of, a good government, is obviously very dangerous. Look at what happens to the Brazilians. They did excellent work. They took more than 40 million people out of poverty. And when it came to the state, that went for them, boom, they went very badly. So the Chavista revolution has had the characteristic of transforming people's culture, not in a sense of, transforming them, indoctrinating them ideologically, although that is there as well. But more important than that is to make sure that they become active participants in the defense of their own rights, which have been guaranteed by the 1999 Bolivarian Constitution. You go to Venezuela, if you haven't, please do. You go to Venezuela. I've been to this supermarket, which are, sell stuff at subsidized prices. I went there and said, can I come in and see? I want to see, and I grabbed a package of rice. And, on the front part, it says, rice, 1 kilo, whatever specification. I turned it to the other side, and there was an article of the Constitution telling the people what their rights were. I said, wow. And then I went for beans, the same thing, flour, the same thing. All the products had the articles of the Constitution. So the people know that what they have got, which is so important and is so significant, is so enormous, their level of participation, women in particular, out of the 52,000 communal councils, 85% the leadership of is women. That gives you an idea. This is the most marginalized, certainly segregated part of society when Chavez came to office. Now they are central to everything. So they know that what they have to lose is so much. So therefore, they are prepared to put up with the sacrifices, put up even some mistakes the government makes, but they know that, this is their government. They are prepared to defend them with everything they have. And were they to go for something mistaken, something stupid, some, whatever promises made by the youngs, they know they will lose everything. In that sense, Venezuela is approaching the levels of politicization that Cuba has, where it's almost impossible unless there is a massive, military invasion. They're not going to do it in any other way. And Venezuela is moving very much in that direction. And the Socialist Party, the Social United Party, so strong. And it's the guiding force. And the trade unions, the organization of the people, this is just an extraordinary new state. It's a new society. It's a new way of doing things. And they want peace. They don't want war. They want peace. They don't want to destabilize anybody. They want to have relations with anybody, no matter what the ideological differences might be. They just want to be respected. And if they say this very seriously, and I've seen them, more or less with tears in their eyes saying it. We don't want a war, but if a war comes, we'll die defending our land.
And recent statement from the Communist Party of Venezuela kind of summed it up when it ended with it's about socialism or barbarism. We think the Venezuelan people have chosen the former and have demonstrated that, much like other societies in Latin America, Cuba, also Nicaragua under the Sandinistas. How do you see Venezuela's role in Latin America? In what way does it provide inspiration for other activists?
Well, when Chavez won the election in 1999, it is the first left-wing government with an anti-neoliberal agenda in a sea of neoliberalism in 1999. All countries, with the exception of Cuba, were neoliberal, and Cuba was in difficulties because of the collapse of the Soviet Union. So he won the election, and then he won another one, then another one, then another one, then another one. Suddenly, the people in Latin America thought, we were not voting for the left because we didn't want, the terrible consequences that followed. They began to vote for the left. And as a consequence, one after another, there was Brazil, Argentina, Bolivia, and so on, all went in a huge, what we call the pink wave. I think this time round, the level of resistance against right-wing government in Brazil, in Bolivia, already in Uruguay, and certainly in Ecuador and in many other in Colombia, are an indication that, number one, the right wing, they might win some victories, but they're totally unable to consolidate them because they have nothing to offer. All that they have to offer is poverty, misery, violence, and repression. And people are not prepared to put up with that, especially after they have, I think, a decade of very nice government. So the very fact that Venezuela is able to resist, it will inspire many of them to continue to resist because you can do it. That's the key message, it seems to me. And the very fact that all these parties in Latin America who are fighting, movements who are fighting against neoliberalism, the worst excesses of it, such as in Brazil, where things are going chaotic, they're looking towards Venezuela. And there are statements today, say, compare the Workers' Party statements some years ago regarding Venezuela, which is very nice, quite careful. Now they're totally solid down the line. And it's a clear indication that they know what it is. And just to illustrate my point with the Brazilian case, very briefly, the Brazilian Workers' Party had the idea that in order to become governable, you have to make an alliance with the center, which they did. And it produced very good results. But then when things got difficult, the center betrayed them and overthrew them or contributed to their overthrowing. Now the Workers' Party decided to strategically to go for an alliance of the left because they know that the only possibility, and they have an alliance with the Communist Party of Brazil, which is the key ally, and then several other left-wing organizations and the left-wing social movements and so on. So this might take a little while, 1 year, maybe a couple of years, but it's much more solid strategically. So that's an indication that, these parties are thinking that, this is the way to go. And let's prepare for the next pink wave, which I think next time is going to be red rather than pink.
Yeah, it's an interesting point. You kind of took the words out of my mouth on that last one. So going into the points about internationalism and the role internationalism has played for Venezuela, Simon Bolivar, who's in many ways, I suppose, comparable in Ireland to our Wolf Tone, maybe, even the school Hugo Chavez went to was named after an Irishman, Daniel Florence O'Leary, who was the aide-de-camp for
Bolivar.
So it's sort of, it shows that Venezuela by no means stands alone, and that what it is doing in Latin America is providing support for all other peoples all over the world, not just in Latin America, to struggle. Could you give any, sort of coming near the end now, could you give any concluding remarks about the lessons of Venezuela?
Yeah. Just one before the conclusion. The United States is declining very badly. I don't have time to go into details, but it's really badly declining. And the one thing which Trump has managed to achieve is to accelerate that decline very massively, like nobody else could have done. The prestige of the United States is absolutely on the floor. Its economy is worse. Its armed forces are in a mess. The budget is completely all over the place, and the situation is chaotic, and they're losing their grip. And even if Joe Biden wins the election, not trust it. He may find himself a president of a much diminished United States, which therefore will not have as a priority to attack Venezuela, although the very powerful interventionist machine might not allow him to deviate. We'll see what happens, but I think this world in that sense is changing quite dramatically, and the number of people in the United States itself is going to, grow in terms of Venezuela, going to grow in terms of sympathy with Venezuela. The concluding remarks are this, unless you put people before profit, and you draw all the consequences that you have to draw from that, in order to ensure that you defend them consistently, you have to have a society organized in such a way that they're able themselves to defend those gains. But in order for the masses to be able to organize themselves, you have to have a state that defends that and protects that. So these are the conclusions. And in order to have the legitimate organs of violence, not being neutral or not being against you, you have to ensure that you transform them as well, as part of the same process. So therefore, the civic, military alliance is so interesting because it shows the ability of Chavez to be able to do this. And the second strategic important, there is more on that, but you can see where I'm going. And there is a second important strategic dimension. When Iran was being sanctioned massively by the United States back 7 years ago, 19 something. And Chavez, paid a visit to Iran, and he gave Iran 20,000 barrels of oil a day to help them with the difficulties that they were having. Now, there is a massive difference ideologically between the Iranian government and the Venezuelan government. Nevertheless, US imperialism, and imperialism is much more dangerous. It's definitely the enemy. And you can collaborate across societies, across cultures, easily. China is an important ally of Venezuela. Russia it is, even Turkey, whatever the difficulties are there, and certainly Iran. So if you want to ensure that these beautiful things that you build in your society, you want to maintain it, you cannot fight alone against the United States. You have to build international alliances, that are convenient for your people. And the Venezuelans, Chavez created the conditions, Maduro has implemented most of them. These two recipes are certainly a recipe for victory. And if everybody were to follow something like that, the Cubans have done it, Venezuelans now are doing it, Nicaragua seems to be doing well, and certainly this is going to span hopefully as soon as possible. We cannot wait.
We've a quote from one of our own revolutionaries in Ireland, Terence McSweeney, that it's not those who inflict the most, but those who endure the most who will win. I think in Venezuela's case, that is very much the case, that Venezuela has endured, as have the peoples of all the world. And I think recent events in the US show that it is an empire in decline, and empires in decline in some ways tend to be the most dangerous, but the resistance to them is also that much stronger. So Francisco, thank you very much for joining us tonight. We hope that we can keep up further discussions dealing with Venezuela, and also further actions in defense of Venezuela, in defense of the Bolivarian Revolution, and for the peoples of Latin America. Next week, we'll be having a discussion at the same time, 7:30 p.m. on Nicaragua. I'll be looking at the slightly similar circumstances in that country, how it is dealing with the aftermath of a coup attempt, and it's also its achievements in bringing socialism and socialist ideas to the people. So, Francisco, once again, thank you very much. Would you like to give any concluding remarks?
This is a great pleasure that I've done this. This is wonderful. I'm really delighted that we did it. We have had the conversation and so on. This is just the beginning of something quite long. So anytime, I'll certainly be in touch with you, because I'm going to be asking for you to do things for us and for Venezuela. And grateful, and I hope that the audience liked it and support us. Any question that anybody may want to ask, please send them to you. I'm quite happy to comment on that.
No problem at all. I'm sure people will. So once again, thank you very much for coming, and Viva Venezuela.
Viva Venezuela.
And I think we leave it there. Thanks to everyone for coming. Next week, we'll be talking with the ambassador of Nicaragua. And as I said, the problems that country has been facing externally, but the successes that it's had internally. So Francisco, hope you'll join us. And thank you very much.
I will. I'm a member of the executive committee of the Nicaragua campaign here, so I certainly have an interest.
So we look forward to working further with you. And once again, Viva Venezuela Libre.
Viva Venezuela. Thank you very much, comrade.